Hello and welcome to another ICMonitor tutorial. Today we will address how to configure file capture settings. We will locate the file capture function in the capture chain to learn where the file capture settings are actually applied. We'll perform a live capture and store it into multiple files. We'll use capture triggers to achieve a similar result. We'll split a large capture file into multiple small ones using file capture settings, and go over the other options you have to reduce capture file size even more. If we look at the ICMonitor telegram processing chain, all telegrams, either from live capture through interfaces or via file capture, eventually pass by the capture file function. This function makes sure that every telegram is stored in a capture file, which by default is a PCAP-NG file. In case of a file capture, each telegram already has a capture file in which it is stored. For live captures, if the configuration is not changed, the ICMonitor creates a temporary capture file for each live capture, in which the incoming telegrams are stored to reduce the memory impact of a live capture. If a user wants to store telegrams in specific capture files during the capture process, the capture file function can be adjusted to suit the use case, be it long-term capture or organizing files that are captured with a trigger configuration. Be aware that capture trigger and capture filter functions are executed before the capture file, so all telegrams that don't make it past those, of course, won't end up in a capture file. The capture file settings can be found under the Capture tab, in the Capture Settings group, in the Capture File dialog. Capture file settings are only relevant if you want to store telegrams during the capture process to a file other than the default capture file. Usually, it's sufficient to just start your live capture, and after stopping it, save file and save capture file. A scenario for specific capture file settings is, for example, a long-term capture, where an otherwise large capture file could get split into multiple files of fixed size. To configure this, we'll go to Capture File, pick a location and name for our capture files, and then specify a file size. With this configuration, the ICMonitor would capture telegrams to our file until it's 1 MB and then stop capture. To split up the capture in multiple and keep going, we check Use Multiple Capture Files. We then have additional options. We can have one capture file per trigger activation, which is nice when you hunt a specific error, or we can stop the capture after we reached a fixed number of files, if we have size constraints, for example. There are other options that we'll discuss later in the video. So let's use those settings and start a live capture on my IPv4 interface. We'll get informed that we have capture settings active, and we can see what they are. In our case, we have a capture file, and we can just analyze telegrams as usual. Now if we go to the location that we configured, we see that there's already one capture file being stored, and we're slowly approaching the 1 MB of size. So I'll get back to you in a second when we have a little bit more data. Now as we can see, we're slowly approaching the megabyte file size that we configured. And upon reaching that, the ICMonitor will generate a second file that has the timestamp of when it was created and will then continue capturing here. While this is happening, we could still use the ICMonitor as usual, perform our analysis, look into nodes, or whatever else we need to do. We'll stop the capture and take a look at the files. If we now take a look in our configured folder, we'll see two files have been created with their respective timestamps, and for your convenience they're also numbered so you don't have to read the timestamps when ordering the files. Another very useful function is to combine file and trigger settings. So let's go ahead and configure an easy trigger condition. We'll set a start and stop condition to ICMP and stop on our first non-ICMP telegram. We'll have the trigger activate continuously, so we get a couple files to work with. If you want to learn more about triggers and how to set them up, check out the capture trigger video on this channel. Now down below we also see our current capture file configuration, and we might want to go over here and first change the name, and then pick one capture file per trigger activation. Let's apply the settings, start a live capture. We'll get informed about our active capture settings, which is the trigger condition and the capture file. And we don't see any telegrams yet because the trigger has not fired yet. So let's go ahead and insert some ICMP telegrams here. We do this with a simple ping to a device in the network. And here we see we have a couple of trigger activations, should be 4. So if we show in our configured folder, we'll find one file for each activation. Let's do this one more time. And our files have multiplied. We can also use those settings on a file capture. So let's discard what we have here. Reset our settings and load a file. Using capture file settings for loading capture files might sound counterintuitive at first, but is actually a powerful tool for certain scenarios. You could split up large capture files into more manageable chunks, or filter out data from files. You can also create multiple smaller files based on capture triggers and reduce the file's content down to the telegrams you're actually interested in, and then send them to colleagues for further analysis. Let's try that out with a capture trigger. We'll go to our file dialog, pick a name, configure a maximum size again and use multiple capture files, and capture file per trigger activation. We'll then go back and set our trigger condition to start on ICMP and stop on any non-ICMP. We'll do this continuous, and we're good to go. Now I actually condensed down the file that we split earlier with trigger conditions into one large file. Just for demonstration, we can load a file here and split it up that way. Again, we get warned about active capture settings. We can check them in the dialog, and we can see how often our trigger was active. If we then go to the capture files, we can now see we have 8 file trigger files and 8 trigger test files, which are the ones that are merged together in a large file. So as you can see, that works wonderfully to get our ICMP out of a large file. Now that we've gone over the most common use cases for file capture settings, let's go back to the settings we omitted in the beginning of this video. First, instead of setting an absolute path or browsing for one, we have the option to specify our path relative to a configured temporary directory. This might come in handy if multiple ICMonitor instances use a network share, for example. And keep in mind, ICMonitor instances don't have to be users. The ICMonitor can be used from a console or an API, depending on the license you own. You can configure the temporary directory going to the Options tab, in the General group, in Directories, and here you can set it. Another option we skipped is the file rotation, or keeping only a fixed number of files. If we activate this option, set it to example to 4, the IC monitor will only keep the latest 4 files and delete all the others. To be able to use this, we need to go over to Options and set our live capture or file capture memory usage level to minimum. Now, if you set your memory usage level to minimum, you won't see telegrams in the Telegram list anymore, and a lot of other views might lack the data you need. So be wary of this and only use it for long-term capture when it's actually necessary. There will be a separate tutorial going over all the options. The reason for this is, if files get deleted, the IC monitor will lose the references to the telegrams displayed here, and thus we cannot operate it in a mode that actually displays telegrams. You can later load the files and have all the data you need. Files can also be compressed, and you can also delete uncompressed files, which requires the same setting we just explained for the file rotation. That does it for the capture file settings. I hope it was informative, and we'll see each other in another tutorial.